Okay. Missing something. Good morning, everybody. Can we make a start? We're web streaming now. I've got to advise everybody as usual that this meeting is being webcast for live or subsequent broadcast, and that members of the press or public may record and take photographs except where there are confidential or exempt items. With that, can I move on to apologies? I have apologies from Vic Brown, from Akid Ahmed, and from Shaman Lal, who's got an NHS appointment this morning. So he's saying he will be late, but I wonder whether he'll actually get here. So I will put his apologies down, and it may be that he will be a little later. With that, can I ask if there are any declarations of interest? Don't expect there will be. There are none. So I can move on then to the action notes. Can we confirm those action notes, please? Okay. I'm trying to get my computer on whilst I'm speaking, but we can then move on to the coordinating overview and scrutiny action tracker. And I just ask whether there is anything to be raised there. No? If not, then we can move on, and this is why I'm trying to get my computer up and running, because I actually have penned a little report. An update report on the customer service program. I can provide this as a script for the minutes afterwards. At its January meeting, we noted the Task and Finish group on the customer service program had completed its review of the recommendations submitted to service leads for bereavement services, housing repairs, waste management and highways. We also agreed that the Task and Finish group should take further action to ensure that the identified end-to-end customer service improvements are implemented. The committee also supported the Task and Finish group in undertaking further work to scrutinise how senior managers are responding to feedback from the customer service standards workshops to embed the customer service strategy. I can tell you that a meeting is now arranged for the 20th of April between myself, the Assistant Director of Programmes Performance and Improvement, and the Assistant Director of Customer Services, along with overview and scrutiny officers, to programme the further work of the Task and Finish group. Results of the staff engagement conducted during the rollout of the customer standards workshops between September 22 and March 23 is now available and is ready to be presented to the Task and Finish group at an earlier date. Now, I was told that Wendy Griffiths might be online. I don't know whether she is. And I was going to ask Wendy whether she had anything to add to what it is I've just said. But since I sent this to her and she told me in response by email that she didn't have anything to add, I doubt it she'd have anything to add verbally during the course of the meeting. So that's the update report. And are there any matters that you want to raise in relation to it? No? Thank you very much. Then we can then move on to the major piece of work to be taken today, and that's the work of the Homes for Ukraine Task and Finish group. We set aside some time for this just in case there is a lot of comment. I'd like to begin by, on behalf of the Task and Finish group, thanking the officers, Richard Saba and Jamila, who are all here. But their assistance throughout the period that the Task and Finish group met was incredibly valuable. I think we all recognise that, and we have got to an end in a remarkably short period of time. And from my perspective, and I think from the perspective of the Task and Finish Group, with a report which is a good critique of the Homes for Ukraine programme. I use the word critique because whilst there was and still can be criticism of some of the actions, what we try to do is look at that in a positive way and learn lessons from where perhaps mistakes were made. And therefore the word critique is very appropriate, because I think the report ends with a number of recommendations, which is about how we can use the experience of the Homes for Ukraine programme in any similar work that the City Council might have to undertake in future. And indeed how to inform the programme as it goes through the remaining period of the programme, where we're helping to support both hosts and guests. With that, I should also say that the Cabinet member responsible for this area did ask whether he needed to come along this morning. I said there was no need for that. He will have to respond to the report in due course, and that he will no doubt do. But I'm going to ask Richard and the other officers who involved themselves in the work of the Task and Finish Group whether they would like to make any comments at this stage, before I then hand it over to other members of the Task and Finish Group for any comments they might want to make, and then open it up to other members of the committee. Richard.
I'd like to make a few very brief comments, if I may. First of all, could I thank Chair Sabbath, who are people who have really done the heavy lifting. Great deal of information presented in the summary and a long report, over 20,000 words of content. And whilst it's not all about weight, it does reflect an enormous amount of work on behalf of the team and people who are not present as well. But for me, the most important thing to take away from this is the small number of really important lessons that we'll carry with us, and that actually we should disseminate across the organisation that have broader application. And if I may, I think there are two things that really stand out from this process as valuable organisational learning. The first of them is about the importance of investing early on in this kind of programme with the communities that are affected, and strengthening our public participation work at the earliest possible stage, even when a crisis response requires rapid action. And I think we've recognised that we didn't get that right in the early stage of this programme. We've invested a great deal of time and effort in getting it right now. I believe we now have an exemplary programme of involvement with stakeholder groups, with hosts in the Homes for Ukraine programme, and with the Ukrainian guests, which is reflected in a wide variety of activity and the meetings and direct engagement we're having with them. And it's being reflected back to us in more positive feedback from the affected communities. But that first lesson about public participation and engagement, I think, is really strong. The second challenges of undertaking to diversify this, to take the earliest action in order to and it's not that easy to actually implement that recommendation. Frequently faced with situations as an organisation where we need to contract constrained in the options with who we can contract with. But that broad message about trying to diversify our risk and acting quickly where we can see things and not as we wish them to be, I think is the other really important point. So what I hope that shows is that there is some really valuable learning here, and that whilst it's been demanding engaging with this scrutiny process, I think it's a good example of the value that scrutiny can add. And I'll be very pleased to take these lessons to my colleagues on the leadership team and around the council to help disseminate and get the impact out of them. That's all I wish to say, Chair.
Thank you very much, Richard. Jamila or Sally, wish to add anything?
No.
Okay. Right, members of the Task and Finish group, there's a comment. Roger, did you want to say something?
Yes. So a number of short observations. First of all, that the process itself was a really good process. I think it is really important in situations like this, where something unexpected a new challenge has come, and it's important to learn the lessons quickly. To have a process like this, rather than the traditional full scrutiny inquiry, and that this sort of process, I think, should be an important part of the toolkit for scrutiny going forward. So I thank everybody who was involved, the officers who were involved in supporting it and making it work that way. And I think that's a positive, very positive learning process, learning lesson in terms of process. In terms of the detail, I mean, I'm glad to hear Richard's comments and would largely agree with them. I think it's really important in situations like this. You look at the lessons in and accept when things go wrong, and look at what can be learned for the future. I was left very much with the impression that in situations like this, it's almost inevitable, perhaps, that the immediate response comes from the community, because the bureaucracy takes a while to get into gear and set up all the processes. And therefore, for the council to acknowledge that more and value that more and work more with those community organisations is, and we've seen it before with COVID, similar sort of situation, is perhaps one of the most important lessons. And I would, just add the thanks that we've been given many times to all those members of the community who did step in and provide that really valuable, important help and support, both in terms of being hosts, but also in terms of the support processes around it in those early days. I think the other things that may not get as much attention out of this, but I just wanted to raise, particularly, I think this is it's a new way of responding to a refugee crisis. But I think we will sadly always be likely to have waves of refugees or crises around the world, and we are a city of sanctuary. So we need to think about what we learn from this that is helpful in the future. And a couple of things did strike me. It was, first of all, about the ESOL provision. We seem to have ESOL provision that, to put it slightly pejoratively, to make the point, is sort of designed for people who want to learn a foreign language one evening a week, so that when they next go on their timeshare in Portugal or wherever, they can go to the local shops a bit more easily than they could last time. And that's all well and good, and it's great that we have provision for that. But we also need ESOL for any refugee that arrives in this city, that will get them up and running with English at a decent level as quickly as possible. And that means, for most of them, they want to be learning every day. They don't want to be learning one day a week. So we need to sort of look at the capacity of ESOL in this city. And, we've got, by the nature of this city, we've got so many people with, multiple language skills in the city. It should not be difficult to put that together. And then also, the integration around the schools. I mean, we know we've had a particular demographic stress, as with the rest of the country, with a peak in the birth rate about 10, 12 years ago going through the system. But I think one of the things that didn't work particularly brilliantly was getting some of the schools on board where there were children coming into that age group. And I hope that it's one of the sort of things left, as it were, well, not unanswered, but it's an issue that was picked up in the report about, it would be good to get some feedback from schools about how we could work more, better with them to ensure that people don't wait for a long time to get places in the schools for their children where there is pressure on school places. So I think that's. I'll stop there. Those are some of my observations. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to echo your opening remarks around how absolutely diligently the office has been in really making this happen, but also to compliment yourself as Chair in coordinating this and pulling it together. I think it's been quite scrutiny showing actually how councillors can very proactively over a very short time come up with quite a comprehensive down to the officers and their commitment on this. So I do want to really echo and to emphasise that. From the very outset, I think we should bear in mind that the origins of this came from quite a large amount of frustration, misunderstanding from residents, which manifested itself in a petition, but also in a motion at full council, which was led by the Liberal Democrats. And I think it's that as a starting point, which we do very much need to be aware of how these misunderstandings and misconceptions can lead and breed into all sorts of ways and make future relationships and workings with councils so much harder because of this misconception. And it's openness and transparency that we very much need to be aware of. There's two lines in the work that we did. Firstly was on the award to the PwC for the database, and secondly on the award for to RA. And in my mind, everything that flowed after that in terms of the award is very secondary, because those are the fundamental starting points on that. On the PwC, I think we've pretty much exhausted that. There's been a lot of discussions around how the award was made, and I think there's very good learning to be come from that, especially if it is pro bono work, which then leads to a substantial contract award. And I think those recommendations are very clear in the document. Secondly, on the ROA itself. So one of the things that I think many of us as councillors were quite surprised to learn out, which came from the discussions, was how council officers ourselves were restricted on which organisations we could approach. So we could be one of the only organisations that were able to take on this work that was already pre-vetted within the council database. So it was that fundamental starting point where actually council was restricted. We didn't have the freedom to go and choose from multiple organisations that actually hampered things from the very beginning. So it's very clear, very quickly, it was officers involved and council involved. But of course, residents saw council being responsible. And I think that's where the misconception really started to breed difficulty, resentment, misunderstandings, frustration, which then spilled onto council. And it's a reputation that we very much need to be aware of. When we move on to the actual award for the contract, of course, there's good lessons to be learned on how we make sure there is diversification. So specifically looking at recommendations 8 to 11, making sure that we have earlier diversification with organisations so that the council has got a big pool to pull from. Where possible, to vet clearly, draw on organisations to make sure that they're able to manifest the work quickly. Also, in a single contract negotiation position. So, because this was under a delegated authority, it went over 2 years. So, I'm very glad to see that one of the recommendations is limiting that to only 12 months. And again, to make sure that we've got open transparency with officers who do work in a delegated and single ward authority to make sure, again, accountability and transparency. There's a number of other recommendations which I think is very important to highlight, but the fundamental starting point of everything is around transparency to make sure that residents know what we're doing, very best of our ability. But it was fundamentally that inability of officers and choose from 5 or 6 organisations. So it's very important, not just on this portfolio, but other areas of the directories to make sure we have that early readiness and able to respond quickly. After this report had been put forward and approved by us, of course, it gets approved by cabinet, and then officers will take it forward within their own departments. But I'd like to see that there is good follow-up, there is good embedding of these recommendations going forward, because of course this isn't new. The processes that we go through in council, especially with single process contract awards, isn't new. It is shrouded in, by its very definition, a need to be urgent and quick. But of course, so that the balance of transparency and accountability is proper and appropriate. So I would like to make sure that in perhaps the future ONS or to future timings that we do see, we have some sort of follow-up to see how this is being embedded, how it is being followed up, to make sure that we very much learn from these lessons. And then the final point, just to really emphasise, is that this was unprecedented work that we put out. A number of people are coming over, the volumes of support required, the devastation, the difficulties that so many of these people coming from fleeing their home under very traumatic circumstances was unprecedented. So we do very much need to bear that in mind when looking at the report, that actually this hasn't been done. Incredible. It did take some time, it did take some learning, and for residents that would just be made to make sure that the acknowledgement of the public sector and organisations and charities and the very much goodwill of residents very much made this programme happen, and it was very much council who was just trying to steer it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, echo what's already been said by Alex and Roger. Big thanks to the team opposite, because without their hard work and input, this wouldn't have happened really, this piece of work. I think the positive approach that we've all talked about was absolutely one of the important aspects to this work. The cross-party approach is important because it's important that we're united when we're doing this sort of work. And, you know, leading to the recommendations that the work has resulted in, I think it is really important, and it's what happens to those next, which is the second stage of that importance, because they can't just be lost somewhere in a filing drawer. You know, we've really got to make sure that, as Richard said, the lessons learned approach is taken, and I welcome his offer of making sure that he disseminates across the board where he can, because I think the task and finish work is really important for us as scrutiny, but it's only going to be effective if officers are willing to commit to it, but also if members commit time to see it through. It's a short piece of work, but it's quite intense, as some of us know. And this piece of work really did take up a lot of time for those involved. For the small number of people involved, it was very, very time consuming. So it does depend on the goodwill of many to come up with something really worth with. I think Alex's point around the transparency and openness is so important, because we started off at a point and finished at a totally different point. And that was actually one of the really good things of the process. I think we tried to be a critical friend all the way through. It wasn't about holding people up and saying you've done this wrong, but it's about trying to understand what those processes were, and for us to understand, and then to make sure that we were able to inform others about those processes. And you know, that unknowing, that sort of misunderstanding and miscommunication and misconception does lead to feelings of and we saw that, feelings of resentment and you know, being not fairly treated. So I think that without doing the task and finish, we would never have got to that point for our own understanding, but also for others. I think we still face some huge challenges across the city in terms of our housing response and school basic, as Alice and Roger have already mentioned, not just for, excuse me, for a response to refugees, but across the board going into in our other parts of the council. We need to really look at that and see how what we can do best to make those offers better. And I think finally, really, it's just sort of, if anybody gets a chance of being on a task and finish group, they should take it up, because it really is a valuable piece of learning, I think, for those members participating in that process. I've done 2 now because I was part of the customer service one, and I think they're really useful tool to have in your armoury to understand the different processes. So just to reiterate, a big thank you to everybody involved. Richard, Jamila and Saba, you were brilliant, and actually we wouldn't have got to the result. We know that without your commitment, so thank you. Thanks, Albert.
Okay. Other members of the
Thanks, Chair. From the report, I haven't seen anything, any engagement with the housing associations. I think in Birmingham we've got quite a few housing associations, big and the medium sized, and the housing association might have some stock with a bit of investment, with a bit of repairs that could be available to the Ukrainian families who want to live independently, and also some of the housing associations might have some stuff which they are intending to dispose, and it will be a lot value for money buying from them rather than from the private sector.
I'll bring to respond to you, but one of the problems that we came across was the issue about housing provision, because government made it clear they weren't going to be supporting in financial terms as to house the refugees. But what is, and therefore, when Refugee Action subcontracted to Spring Housing, they subcontracted for Spring Housing to signpost the guests, the refugees, rather than provide what is needed at this moment in time, the provision of housing for them to move on to. So that's something that the Task and Finish group reflected on, because there is a real need at this present moment in time. And the contract that Refugee Action had was set up in a format, in a manner which didn't recognise that need, if you like, would be what we ended up with and would have to be resolved. But let me pass it across to the officers if they want to add some comment. And I'll bring you in then, Ewan.
I mean, it's one of the areas that we do recognise around having engaged with the wider housing market as associations. We are working very closely with our housing teams, and they're engaging with housing partnership groups that do exist. There are partnership forums for housing associations. Understand what options there are as part of the Move On programme to support our Ukrainian guests. So there is more engagement now than there previously was, but that's through some of the lessons that we're learning about what the needs of our Ukrainian guests are and how we can best support them. And I would envisage that engagement to only grow, but capacity around doing that is always going to be a challenge.
Can I briefly this? Just on the wider housing issue, we are essentially expecting to ultimately see around 300 families of Ukrainian guests rehoused somewhere in the city after they leave their hosting arrangements. So hosting arrangements were originally for 6 months, then extended to 12 months. We're seeing some hosts extend their offer beyond that period. But ultimately, all of these people will need to move out of their host accommodation into somewhere in the city. And of course, in the wider city, we have just an enormous pressure on housing, whether it's in the social housing sector or in the private rental sector. The very interesting thing created a support package to financially support people into private sector accommodation, which is quite a valuable package. Very few local authorities that provide that. And this is at the moment working quite successfully. I'm not sure what the very latest figures are for several.
Around 50.
Is all of these people are competing for scarce resources in a city which is facing using the available resources to particularly support this.
Ewan, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I think it's important to probably congratulate the officers on a wider level because, you know, it's been a long time since we've ever seen, you know, anything to the scale that we've seen in Ukraine. I think that it's very the element of bravery to do something about it. It's quite easy to sit there and find excuses and step forward and put forward a package to try and help people. You know, does need a bit of proactiveness. Obviously, mistakes are going to be made to find out what's gone and what can we do better next time. But I think the fact that the officers, etc., step forward and actually try to do something proactive to help in a situation with it, and obviously we'll learn from mistakes and we move on. I think hindsight's something that's very easy to do after the event, but it's not always helpful because the one thing you want to do is you don't want to stifle people, make them unable to feel that they're not going to step forward next time around because you know, people have been overly critical. So I think the fact that tried to attempt to do something and had a success it had is something we should all be very pleased about as a council. Thank you for that.
Can I move on then to the recommendations? And I want to add to the recommendations. I'm recalling the comment from Kerry just a moment ago that we need to make sure that this report doesn't lie in an in tray somewhere. The recommendations will require the cabinet member to consider the recommendations, but I think something else is also needed. So we have 3 recommendations. The first, I'll take them in turn. The first is to review and agree any amendments to the proposed recommendations as set out in Appendix A. I don't know of any amendments, so I presume that we can agree a review and the recommendations as set out in Appendix A. Yep, submit final recommendations to the Cabinet Member for Social Justice, Community Safety and Equality for a formal response. And I'm presuming we will agree that as well. And it's the final recommendation that I want to amend. It says at the moment, note the full report, which sets out the supporting evidence as set out in Appendix B. And I want to add the words, and submit the report to the Chief Executive for the Chief Executive to report back on any management actions that arise from consideration of the full report. Therefore, in terms of the second recommendation, which relates to the political wing, if you like, of the council, the cabinet member will need to consider the report and the recommendations. But I do think also that management need to do so as well, which is why I've added the words to the third recommendation in relation to the chief executive. With that, would you agree that final recommendation as I have amended it? Alex?
May I ask, Chair, your amendments points 2.2, 2.3 is just to ask for the feedback from the cabinet member and also chief exec to be on a point-by-point basis to make sure that each of the individual recommendations are followed up directly.
That's it. Which I'm sure happens. Officers have, I think, probably made a note of your comments as well. Okay, all 3 therefore agreed, and the final one as amended. Thank you very much. it has been, I think, a very useful task and finish exercise, and I think the result is a good one. Having said that, we can move on to item 8, which is the scrutiny work programme for 22-23, and we're asked to recommend any issues that should be carried on or new issues to be included. I am going to be in discussion thank you indeed. I'm going to be in discussion with members of this committee about the future of force scrutiny in 22-23. I have emailed out this morning both to the members of the opposition members of this committee, but also to the Labour group, the recommendations that I'm putting forward in terms of the remits of overview and scrutiny committees, for which coordinating has some responsibility in the Constitution. But I'm also going to discuss with members of this committee over the coming weeks how it is that we might set about our work in 22-23, because I think there are lessons for us to learn from, 23-24. I think there are lessons for us to learn from what it is we've done in the current municipal year. So I guess what I'm saying is that in terms of the future work programme for the committee, that will come up undoubtedly in further discussions that we will be having over coming weeks. I can then take on board anything that's said here. I just wonder whether anyone wants to say anything now before I just conclude on what will need to continue into the next municipal year. Anybody? No? In which case, just to remind you, we're being asked to note that the scrutiny inquiries on children and young people's mental health and on child criminal exploitation will continue into the next municipal year, and the inquiries will continue under the existing terms of reference, and also including the lead committees, and that we should recognise the membership of task and finishes groups which have operated under coordinating ONS in this municipal year. One of them will need to continue on into the next municipal year. That's the one on customer services rather. Okay. So with that, I'm left with requests for call-in, council call for action. Nothing has been received on that. Other urgent business? Any other urgent business? No. There is no date for the next meeting as yet, because this is the last meeting for coordinating ONS for this municipal year, and the date for the next meeting, therefore, in the 23-24 municipal year has yet to be confirmed. With that, I can move on to item 12, which is the authority to chair and officers, the normal motion about an urgent situation between meetings. The chair, jointly with the relevant chief officer, has authority to act on behalf of the committee. Agree that? And at 20 to 12, rather earlier than I suspected, I can conclude the meeting. Thank you very much. I'm going to be meeting with Roger